Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast. Many of us struggle with sales, whether it's from confidence, comfort, and just not wanting to be salesy. We want to help our customers. We know we can, but we complicate the process. This podcast is designed to help professionals like you improve at sales through process, practice, frameworks, and thinking differently about what you already know. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and with us is the founder of Catalyst Sale, Mike Simmons, and this episode is brought to you by the Game Plan course. Mike, let's start there. What is the Game Plan course?
So the Game Plan course is a course to help you create clarity and focus as you build out your goals and ultimately put a plan together that will ensure execution. So it's execution on goals via clarity and focus. And it includes a framework. It's a 15-day course. It's pretty intense. It's 15 minutes per day, 15 days in a row. And coming out of that course, you will have a 30, 60, 90-day plan that you will use to execute on your goals and objectives.
And where can we go to find out more?
If you go to catalystsale.com/courses, catalystsale.com/courses, and we'll include a link in the show notes. It will take you to a list of all of the Catalyst Sale courses, and the Game Plan is one of a couple of courses that are listed on that page.
All right. To the topic of the show, Mike, we're going to talk about calls with prospects. How do you prepare for that initial conversation with a prospect?
You know, I know every time I start talking about putting the links in the show notes, I just can kind of sense Jen cringing as she's listening to these. But we'll include a link in the show notes to the discussion that we've had in the past about the call plan and the call plan template. I don't want to get into a lot of detail around call planning. At a high level, it's who's going to be in the room, what are their objectives, what are our objectives, and what are our desired next steps. But when it comes to getting ready for that call, there are so many things that we can do to put ourselves in the best position to have a successful call. And I would love to chat about a couple of those.
Well, and this is something I think that is so relevant because we can't just go in cold. And I'm looking forward to this because Mike is pro. If there was anyone I was going to call and say, I'm about to get on a conversation or a call to have a conversation with a prospect for the first time, and I wanted some advice, some counsel, Mike Simmons is the one I'd call for that. So let's get into it, Mike.
Thanks, Jody. So the first question I'd want to answer, I'm sure people are thinking about this, is number one, how did I find out about this person who I'm going to speak with? Was it because of some outbound outreach that I did, cold outreach that I did based on this person fitting our ideal customer profile, based on them both from an organization level and an individual level? So it's some outreach that I did, or did this person come to our organization? Did they fill out a lead form? And the reason why it's important to know and distinguish between those two things is because the expectations that the person might have on the other end could be completely different depending on whether or not they came in from an inbound perspective because they were interested in us, they found something interesting, they wanted to learn more information, so they filled out some kind of form, versus someone who we had identified because we think they have the problem we solve for, they're part of our ideal customer profile, and we are conducting the outreach directly to them. So in the first one, where they came in from an inbound request, ideally, we've got systems set up where we have a little bit of information about what compelled them to engage with us. They might have shared some notes in that inbound form. They might have been very deliberate about what they were looking for. They might have asked for a demo, as an example. In another thing they might have done is they might have looked at a couple of pages on our website. If you've got HubSpot plugged in, or you have a number of other sales enablement tools that are available, you might have some information about what did they do? Did they go and look at a couple of pages on the site? Did they take a look at pricing? Did they look at some case study information? I want to gather as much information as I can about the person based on data that we collect in our system or our websites that will help indicate what is important to them, why might they have come to us, and what information do they know? And I should be able to get that through the data that's available on the website. So that'd be the first thing I do if it's an inbound lead. On the other side, If it's somebody that I'm reaching out to because I identified them, I saw something that they did something to indicate that they might have the problem that we solve for, or they fall within our ideal customer profile from either an organization or individual level. In that instance, I'm not going to have a lot of information about what they've done on the site unless they happen to come back to the site after we did our initial outreach. What I should know, though, is what compelled me to engage with them. Was it something they had in their LinkedIn profile? Was it something they posted on LinkedIn or Twitter? Was it a podcast episode that they recorded something on? What's the reason? What was the initial reason for me identifying them? And based on that, I should have a sense for what kind of challenges they see in their role and how those align with the problems we solve from an organization perspective. Beyond that, I can gather some other information. I could gather information about their company. If they're a publicly traded company, I could read their proxy statements. I could read other financial statements. I could look at things like the About Us page. There's so much data that's out there in the marketplace that we can look at to help us understand or at least inform us on the types of questions we may want to ask in that initial conversation that we have with someone. Now, the interesting thing is you could actually use the same approach for information in an instance where someone comes from an inbound perspective. And I would suggest that you do, even though you've got the background data on things that they've touched and things that they've looked at on your site, you should also go through the process of trying to figure out why did they actually show up? And you can do that through the same stuff that we just talked about, looking at About Us page, looking at LinkedIn posts, looking at information about how they present themselves out in the marketplace.
So there's our first question. How did I find out about this person? With the figure, well, it depends if it's inbound, outbound. I'm taking a lot of notes, more than usual during an episode, Mike. So there's our first question. We've done that. We've gone through the process of figuring out why they're here, why they're going to be on a call. Where do we go next?
Yeah, then from there, what I want to figure out is what are some of the things that I'd like to know? Because there's some gaps. I'm not going to be able to, you can look at all the public information, all the social stuff that they share, all the information that they refer to, any data that they've put out in the marketplace. That's all public information. I can gather some information there, and that should inform some questions. But there's some private information that I'm only going to be able to get from the person I'm speaking with. So what are some of the questions? What are some of the gaps? What are some of the pieces of information that I need to understand in order to do a couple of things? One, validate that they actually have the problem that we solve for. Two, validate that they care about that problem. If they do care about that problem, why do they care about that problem? What's the business impact? How does it impact them in their individual role? It might not even be business impact. It might be personal impact from a professional perspective. But I want to know what and why, and if I can get to it, some of the hows. And these all come in the form of questions that I can ask, I can be prepared to ask when we have that initial conversation. I'm sure some of you have a list of 20 questions to business fit and some other ways that you go about doing these things. And these are the specific questions that your team, your organization asks you to ask customers. One of the challenges there is sometimes those questions are scripted out too much and they won't feel very conversational when you're having the discussion with the person on the other end. Someone will feel like they're going through a qualification form. That initial call, what I'm trying to do is just discover things. I'm trying to gather information. I'm either going to validate what I've seen publicly and do that through questions. That might be, when I was on your website, I noticed that you're doing that you've spent a lot of time working with organizations in this vertical. Is that a vertical that you tend to focus on? I mean, what I'm trying to do is demonstrate that I've done some research. On the other side, it might be something like, when I was on your LinkedIn profile, I noticed a lot of times you talk about sales process and methods. It seems like this is something that's really interesting to you. How have you evolved your process and methods over the course of the last 30, 60, 90 days or something to that effect? My point in these is that I want to ask questions that have context, and that context can be driven by the research that I did to get prepared for the call.
Okay, so I think this is a good one. I can relate this to podcasting. Not that I know it's a stretch to have podcast and a sales call and say they're similar, but I like to prepare for podcast interviews. If it's someone I don't know well yet, I'd prepare beforehand because I've found it allows me to listen, just listen to them. Because if I have questions I know I want to ask, then I don't have to be thinking about the next question and I can just listen, which then quite often leads to better questions because now I've had to listen. And just because I wrote out, let's say 10 questions beforehand, doesn't mean I stick to them like a script, but it does help me understand beforehand what I want to know from the person that I'm talking to.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities in when you're preparing for an interview, whether it's a podcast interview or podcast discussion, or preparing for an interview, if you're going out and looking for a job, or you're preparing to interview or have a conversation with a potential prospect. The foundational things that you're doing are still the same. You're gathering information and trying to figure out, anticipate what's important to that person. Why is it important to that person? And going from there.
Okay, so what comes after this step?
So we talked about it right at the front end of the discussion, having the call plan. I put this information into the call plan. I use it to inform the call plan. So based on the data that I gathered, I start to anticipate what are their objectives. And I think it's important to look at it and say anticipate, because you're not going to guess their objectives 100% of the time. I mean, sometimes you get into a situation where you think their objective is one thing, and when you have the conversation, it's completely different. You think that you're having a conversation with them to help them on something in their business, and they're actually having the conversation because they want to interview you. It could be a number of different things, but you're anticipating objectives on their side. On our side, though, we should know what our objectives are. We should have a high level of clarity of what our objectives are. And in an initial call, my expectation is that our objective is to gather as much information as we can. Beyond gathering as much information as we can, we want to deliver some kind of value back to the prospect or the potential customer. If they've asked for a demo, don't avoid the demo. Gather a little bit of information on the front end from a discovery perspective, and then go into a high level demo and maybe set the stage that you want to have a follow-up conversation with a deeper level discussion around capabilities. But this third piece, after we've looked at the information and we've started to prepare for our questions so that we can address the gaps that we have, there should be a clear understanding or consideration for the design of the call to help you support addressing the objectives both from the prospect or customer's side of the equation and executing on your objectives from your side of the equation.
Okay, and where do we go from there?
So, I think we've hit on the main pieces. Like, right now we just did a lot of work. I mean, I don't know, I haven't been keeping track of time, but we've spent a lot of time kind of talking about doing some of the research meaning what people are doing socially, what is happening inside press releases, what is happening inside financial statements, all of these kind of sources of information. Then we're preparing the types of questions that we want to ask because we want to be able to address some gaps that we found in the research that we were doing. We have the understanding of what we anticipate their objectives are, what our objectives are. And then last piece I want to do before I go into that call is I want to make sure that I have clarity around what my desired next steps are. What is it that we want to do next? Because if we know where we want to go before we go into the call, or what we would like the outcome to be before we go into a call, then we'll be in a better position to design to support executing on that in the call. And I know this starts to bridge into that discussion around call planning. And we will include a link to the show where we talked specifically about call planning. So take the combination of the research that you're doing, the design work that you're doing, and then the documentation and the call plan, and you will have better calls with your customers and prospects.
Well, this has been good to get on to hear directly from Mike what he does for research. And this is all before the call. Well, I guess there is the piece where you validate that they have the problem. That I know happens during the call, but to know before the call what are the pieces of information you want to get during the call, this is so helpful to understand how you prepare for these conversations, Mike.
Well, I think one of the things you can do is you can start to validate or at least anticipate that they have the problem based on public information. There are some times where some people will comment in LinkedIn. They'll say, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Does anybody have any recommendations on where I should start?" And if somebody who knows you sees that post, likely they're going to comment in that post and say, hey, I think you should take a look at what Jody has done in the Podcast Magic course and follow what he's doing on LinkedIn and Twitter. And so you would be able to look at that thread and see that they have some aspect of the problem. What you don't understand is the complete scope of the problem. Is their problem that they want to create a podcast just because it sounded like a cool thing to do and they were looking for something extra to add to their list of stuff? Or had they been struggling with creating a podcast for a number of months, and no matter what they've been able to do, they haven't been able to get it off the ground? These are going to be public pieces of information that you can use in that discussion to, one, validate that the problem exists, but then also get an understanding when you ask your questions, when you're talking to that person directly, why they've struggled with being able to solve it. Have they not been able to solve it because they just don't know? Have they not been able to solve it because they've not prioritized it? Or have they not been able to solve it because of some other reason?
That's good to know. I've had that very thing happen where somebody recommends me and I just reach out, but I didn't go through some of these steps. So now this is a great way to, in that situation, if you get recommended, rather than just say, hey, Mike, I know Dan Cockrell recommended me, or I saw your conversation, whatever. I just want to see if there's any way I can help. Man, if you take just a little bit of time and do some of this research beforehand, it really changes the conversation.
And I think that's a key piece there, Jody, is just take a little bit of time. Like, we've taken more time talking about this than it should take for you to execute on this. And I'll say that again. We've taken more time talking about it than it should take for you to execute on this. You should be able to do this base level research in just a couple of minutes, and it will separate you from every other sales rep, consultant, person out there in the marketplace. Now, when you're talking about large enterprise deals and you're deeper into the discussion and you're really getting into the details, then yeah, that's going to take a little bit more time. And then you start to get into things like account planning in addition to the call plans. But for this stuff that we're talking about, it's basic and it shouldn't take you much more than 10 to 15 minutes. And if you're not spending that 10 to 15 minutes, how do you justify taking the customer or prospect's time if you're not willing to invest your time?
All right, Mike, do you have any closing thoughts for us on research?
I think that was it. Like, just go out there and do the research, do the work. Don't overcomplicate it. Come in with a couple of simple pieces of information and test a lot of stuff. You'll start to get your own stride and you'll start to figure out what works and what happens when you overdo things and how you can be prepared. That, and then make sure you check out the podcast episode on the call plan. Those 4 foundational areas or barriers that we've got in the call plan. For those of you who've not seen it, it's just a square. It's a square shape. And there are 4 borders. Who's going to be in the room? What do we anticipate are their objectives? What are our objectives? What are our desired next steps?
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.